Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Wednesday, November 30th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The game against Michigan is in 360 days. The game for Ohio State is Friday. It is the Pac-12 championship game. It is USC playing Utah. And then if failing that, the game for Ohio State is also Saturday. Did I say Saturday before? I meant Friday for the Pac-12 championship game. Saturday is the Big 12 championship game. That is TCU and Kansas State. Their Buckeyes are going to have their red and black on Friday night, and their purple and silver on Saturday. Going to need some help if they're going to make the college football playoff this year. The final edition of the rankings came out on Tuesday night, and Ohio State currently sitting in fifth behind number 1 Georgia, number 2 Michigan, number 3 TCU, number 4 USC, Buckeyes number 5, Alabama number 6. We are going to break down what it all means. My guest is Tony Gerdeman of BuckeyeHuddle.com. Tony, I guess let's start with a very simple question. Is this good news for Ohio State? Is this bad news for Ohio State? Is this just kind of okay? What's the deal? How did you interpret what we learned on Tuesday night?
I guess it depends on what paper you're reading. If you're reading the paper from Fort Worth, it's probably bad news for Ohio State. If you're reading the paper from LA, it's good news for Ohio State. Having Ohio State behind USC, that's a wash, really, because they're not getting in ahead of USC without USC losing in the Pac-12 championship game. So them being next to each other, Ohio State would jump them. I think the real issue that is there is that Ohio State being 5 tells you the committee already has some questions about them. And then if USC loses, how close can Ohio State get to overtaking USC? Because we came into this, I think maybe after the Michigan loss, talking about, well, if TCU or USC loses, then Ohio State they're in, obviously. But then as you look at it, and now especially with Ohio State being 5, TCU being 3, does one loss for TCU eliminate them in terms of Ohio State standing? Does Ohio State jump TCU when they have the same amount of losses? TCU has one more win. And really, for me, having Ohio State 5 and not 4, not really close to TCU at this point, I think that is a concern for Ohio State fans. And if TCU loses, it's going to be a nerve-wracking watch on the selection show if it's between Ohio State and TCU for Buckeye fans.
Yeah, and that's not going to be anything new. It feels like every single year we go into the college football playoff ranking reveal show, and Ohio State is always on the cusp. They're either number 4 or they're number 5, or they're number 3, but it's controversial, or they're number 6, but maybe if things fall just right. There's always some drama on Selection Sunday for Ohio State. I think 2019 is the only time that I've thought they are definitely in. There's no question at all. Every other year there's been at least some drama for one reason or another. So this year the drama is going to surround that Friday USC-Utah game. If USC loses, if USC wins, they're in. If USC loses, with Ohio State only being one spot behind USC, do you see any way that USC could lose very close, and it's a controversial late call, and maybe they should have actually won? Is there a scenario where USC loses and still gets in ahead of Ohio State?
I don't think there is, because you look at the wins that USC has, their top wins compared to Ohio State's top wins. What USC's top win would be, Washington at number 12. Ohio State's top win being Penn State at 8. So you look there. The loss, obviously the extra loss. I think right now, if you have 2 losses, you are out. And I don't even think Alabama can get in there. We may talk about that. I don't know. But yeah, I can't manufacture a reason to keep USC ahead with a loss when this is right now they're playing with no room for error. So if they have an error and they lose, there's no room for you. You're out. And it's that second loss does it to everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think I agree with that. I can't imagine a 2-loss non-Pac-12 champion USC whose best win is against number 15 Oregon State on the road, 17-14, gets in against over a 11-1 non-Big Ten champion Ohio State, whose best win is against a number 8 Penn State by a couple scores, also on the road. And you look at a bunch of the advanced metrics, and by pretty much all of them, USC is clearly not really in the same neighborhood as all the other teams, which is why I was actually a little surprised to see them be ahead of Ohio State right now. You look at SP Plus, they're like 12 points behind, worse than Ohio State. You look at their strength of schedule, and their strength of schedule was in the 50s, and Ohio State and TCU are in the 30s, and Alabama's in the 20s. And there's nothing really other than USC winning their division that really would make you think that USC would be ahead of Ohio State, which is why that was so surprising. The committee, it sure sounded like, Tony, the whole rationale for dumping Ohio State down to 5 instead of 4 was how that game ended, and the fact that Ohio State was close. It was a real close game. It was a very competitive game. Ohio State's winning, halfway through the game. They were winning at halftime, I think, and then it just kind of all fell apart in that fourth quarter. That 21-3 fourth quarter is right now, it sounds like, the difference between being 4 and being 5.
Yeah, and that's one. It's a hard one to ignore, and I think the 1 point loss is always going to trump a 23-point loss, no matter when those last 15 points came. But I think the thing to note there is that the committee saw the entire game. That's something that Boo Corrigan always talks about. Well, we see all of the games, and they look at all of the box scores, and they read all of the reports, and they don't just look at the scores. And so for Ohio State, this isn't seen as a one-sided loss. So this is just seen as a loss that happened in the fourth quarter. And it becomes a quality loss because it's also against the number 2 team in the nation. So that loss, it's not a devastator. It's not a one-sided loss like the committee talked about Tennessee having against Georgia. That was seen as a one-sided loss. This is a loss that happened in the fourth quarter of a game that Ohio State led at the half, and it was late scores that created the distance, not late scores by Tennessee that made it look closer than it was, type of thing. So they are at least acknowledging that while the score was a 23-point win, it wasn't a blowout, a one-sided affair, which I think is good for Ohio State once they get compared to other teams in this scenario.
One of the other teams that they are certainly getting compared to right now is Alabama. Crimson Tide, 1 spot behind Ohio State right now, with Ohio State not playing, with none of Ohio State's quality wins playing this weekend, with Alabama not playing this weekend, with none of Alabama's quality wins playing this weekend. It certainly seems like Alabama should remain behind Ohio State almost no matter what, which that feels like that's potentially a piece of very, very good news for Ohio State.
Yeah, right now, to me, Ohio State is the floor, and it is also Alabama's ceiling. Like they can't move ahead of Ohio State, because what is going to happen in the next week to change Alabama's positioning over Ohio State? Nothing that Alabama can do, nothing that anybody is doing ahead of them is going to look better for Alabama. And really the only change would be LSU beating Georgia. How does that make Alabama look better than Ohio State? Or Purdue beating Michigan. How does that make Alabama look better than Ohio State? They already feel pretty good about Michigan. Michigan's not going to miss the playoffs with a loss. So even at that point, Ohio State losing to a team in the playoffs, a top 4 team, doesn't materially change anything as it regards Bama. So I think Alabama is out, and I think Boo Corrigan was clear about that on ESPN, and then maybe backed off of that in his comments in a teleconference.
Inconsistent commentary from the committee, Tony? What? In this historical first, I will. Yeah, probably. We have seen the criteria change from week to week, from day to day, from show to show, sometimes within the show. So yes, that is not a new thing. I guess the last thing we need to touch on is TCU, and TCU being, the thing that I think is most significant to me about Ohio State being 5 and not 4 is that puts, there's a little bit of an air gap there between TCU and Ohio State now, where if Ohio State's 4 and TCU's 3 and TCU loses by a field goal, the committee is, potentially has Ohio State close enough to TCU that a 3-point TCU loss could bump them behind Ohio State. If TCU's 2 spots ahead of Ohio State, I don't know that a TCU, if USC wins and TCU loses by 3, I think there's going to be some real drama as far as, was that a big enough loss to bump TCU down, or does Ohio State bump up ahead of them? The fact that TCU is 2 spots ahead, though, that's not so good for Ohio State.
Well, and TCU was 2 spots ahead of Ohio State at this point in 2014 as well, but it required a 59-0 Ohio State win in the Big Ten championship game to move up 1 spot, and then TCU dropped out a couple of spots. I think once they finally get to really piecing all of this together with Ohio State and TCU, because right now TCU doesn't have a loss, so you're not even necessarily talking about them with Ohio State. You're not comparing the two this time around. When they had the same number of losses, Ohio State was clearly ahead of TCU. So what happens now if TCU loses and they again have the same number of losses? Will the difference be that TCU's win last week over Iowa State makes them better than Ohio State? Because that's basically what you're saying at that point. Because and up until then, like, Ohio State was clearly ahead of TCU. So if they have the same number of losses again, I don't see the decider being, hey, TCU got that win over Iowa State and Ohio State didn't. That's not really any good way to decide between two teams. So I still think Ohio State has all of the arguments. It's just you're going to need the committee. They need to be willing to hear them, and not. You're talking about the analytics with USC and TCU. At this point, it's like they don't need to look at all of that stuff just yet. Like, once they need to, then maybe they will, and they'll see the error of their ways, Tom.
Yeah, we'll have to see. This is going to be a very dramatic weekend for Ohio State, as it always seems to be this weekend every single year. Friday night, the Pac-12 championship game. Can Utah beat USC for the second time this season and probably more or less punch Ohio State's ticket to the playoff? And if not, can Kansas State beat TCU and beat TCU by enough on Saturday to potentially punch Ohio State's ticket to the college football playoff? And it could be a very dramatic Sunday coming up in Columbus. We are going to have a whole bunch on this coming up throughout the week. It's going to be a busy week in Columbus. Ohio State playing Duke in basketball a little later on tonight. We'll have coverage of that at BuckeyeHuddle.com. And then, of course, plenty of football talk as well. It's always football season. It's always recruiting season. It's always Ohio State Buckeyes season in Columbus. So we'll have a whole bunch on all of that stuff coming up this week at BuckeyeHuddle.com and, of course, at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. I'm going to guess one way or the other, we will have plenty to talk about on Sunday as well, depending on where Ohio State is ticketed to go play their postseason games, and will they be in the playoff? Will they be headed somewhere else? And what will that mean in terms of who will play in all the games? All of that fun stuff to talk about later on this week. So that will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.